I'm Dr. Meredith Warren at the University of Sheffield, and I'm also the editor-in-chief of the Journal for Interdisciplinary Biblical Studies. And I'm going to moderate the discussion we're having today on the ethics of citation in light of several incidents of sexual violence and sexual abuse in our guild. Emily, do you want to introduce yourself and we'll go around?
Sure. Hi, I'm Emily Schmidt. I am currently adjunct faculty at Santa Rosa Junior College in humanities and religion in Santa Rosa, California. I have a BA from UC Santa Barbara and MTS from Harvard Divinity School, and I advanced to candidacy for a PhD at UCSB and never filed. So that's me.
Mark?
Hi, thank you. I'm Mark Lucher. I'm professor of Hebrew Bible and Ancient Judaism at Temple University in Philadelphia. I'm currently also a Frankel Center Fellow at University of Michigan. And I did my PhD at University of Toronto in 2003.
Stephen?
Yeah, I'm Stephen Young. I'm at Appalachian State University in North Carolina. I've studied ancient Judaism and early Christianity, and thus have the privilege of being colleagues with all the wonderful people here in this conversation.
Thanks. Stephen, do you want to actually start us off with a little bit of context about one of the people that sort of sparked this conversation?
Yes. So as many folks are aware, last year, Jan Justin, who is a professor of Hebrew Bible and actually had, from my understanding, one of the more prestigious chairs in our field at Oxford University, he was convicted of having 27,000 images of child pornography and I believe 1,000 videos of it. And many of these were of, and this is, again, I guess there's a trigger warning for this whole conversation, but many of these images were images that were of violent torture and sexual abuse of children, and many of them of Asian children, by the way. So there's an important white supremacy or racial component to this too. So, I mean, this is a vortex of trash that we are dealing with here in this situation. But sort of the issue here isn't simply that Justin was convicted and spent a year in jail and he just got out. It's that when he was convicted, when the story came out, it wasn't so much that there were a lot of scholars who were actively defending Justin, but there was this surge among even some more senior and established people in the field to defend his reputation and really insist that we needed to continue citing him and promoting his excellence. And then the other thing that has precipitated this specific conversation is when Justin got out of jail, I forget the exact day, I mean, it was like a week or two ago, within several
Erev
days.
Yom Kippur. He posted this on Erev Yom Kippur.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm pausing because it's just it's absurd, but within a couple of days of getting out of jail and on Erev Yom Kippur, he posted a public statement, talking about his great desire to come back into the guild, and with, an apology that wasn't really fitting. But as an aside, and we'll get into this, from my point of view, part of this discussion, what's driven a key part of this context is that so much of the focus on this discussion in scholars and colleagues of his has been on Justin himself and on whether he's really sincere in his apology or, how do we understand this? And it's taken a lot of attention off of the victims of what's happened and letting that weigh in on or frame how we go about imagining, do we want to have a field that is hospitable to abusers, where they can expect their work to be cited, where victims of abuse will have to continue experiencing them being cited. And I don't want to preempt our discussion, but I mean, that's sort of the context in trying to think about multiple interlocking issues here that are happening, not just Justin's crimes, but how the field is part of the common sense of the field still promotes people who want to protect the reputation of someone like that.
Mm-hmm. And of course, he's far from the only sexual predator in our guild, right? So, Emily, do you want to talk about one of the other prominent examples?
Absolutely. So in 2001, Richard Purvo, who was a scholar in New Testament, and who wrote a very important book on the dating of the Book of Acts. So his book essentially shoved the Book of Acts well into the 2nd century and has really shaped the way that scholars think about sort of Luke Acts and the sort of chronology of New Testament work this way. And in 2001, he was convicted of having images of child sexual abuse on his computer. And if I recall correctly, it was his work computer. And he was convicted of 5 counts of possession and 1 count of distribution. So it was a lesser crime than Houston's, I guess. But here's the kicker. After he was released from jail, I found 17 papers at the SBL meetings. I didn't verify to see if they were all domestic annual meetings or international, but 17, at least 1 book review in JBL, at least 3 in RBL. I haven't been able to do a thorough search. This is just what came up in my quick search. But at least one of those reviews in RBL was a review of translations of Greek erotic poetry. And then when Pervo died, SBL published a sort of glowing obituary of this person, in part because, right, his work on Acts was and still is probably incredibly important, but nowhere did it account for the fact that he had been involved in harming children. And so that is sort of the precursor to even what was coming up with Houston. And, after Pervo, Elaine Pagels, in her memoir, Why Religion, describes some pretty awful events committed by Helmut Kester, who is very obviously, for those of us in New Testament studies, one of the sort of scholars in the history of New Testament studies, particularly in the United States. And in her book, this is on, I was looking at the ebook, but on pages 24 to 26 or so, she describes essentially being trapped in his basement after staying with his children sort of as a sitter. And he decided to drive her home that evening. She doesn't have a car. She's not sure where she is. So he gives her a blanket and, sets her to sleep on the sofa. And then she is awoken by him sneaking into the basement and groping her. And she has to defend herself against this sort of attack. And she can't do anything because she doesn't have a car. She doesn't know where she is. She can't really call anyone because who's going to believe this, graduate student over the illustrious Helmut Kester, professor at Harvard University? And she reports that when she started filing reports about this and talking to people in official capacities at Harvard, she learned that therapists at Harvard Health Services referred to him as Kester the molester. So this is not a situation where Kester was convicted, but there is a credible accusation and there is credible history. And when I started talking about this with folks that I studied with at Harvard when I did my MTS, a number of them were like, "Oh yeah, you didn't know this?" And no, I didn't know this. I worked very closely with Helmut and spent part of a summer doing an archaeology tour research seminar in Greece, with him. And something that I just want to add that is not particularly related to child sexual abuse or to sexual assault, but connects both of these with patriarchy and misogyny. On page 38 of her book, she says that when she told him, he was her dissertation advisor, apparently when she told him that she was going to get married, he said, "You're one of our best students." I'm reading now from her book. You're one of our best students. We've wasted 4 years on your education, and you're getting married. And she reports that he also tried to cut off her funding from Harvard, and reports that Krister Stendahl, who was the dean at the time, stopped that right away. So this is not only about Jen Houston, and his tens of thousands of images. I think we all probably agree that the issue is not an individual case, but a series and repetitive pattern of sexual abuse of various kinds and related issues. As Stephen said, things like white supremacy and racism and sexism. So there's there's a lot of background to what we're getting at.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that people often have sort of hand-wringing trouble with when the ethics of citation come into question is like, well, how am I supposed to write about Acts without citing Purvo? Or how am I supposed to write about the New Testament without citing Kester? And so, there's a kind of like just throwing up their hands of like, well, I don't really have the imagination to go and look elsewhere for my citations. And so I'm just going to go to the default, which has been the default for the past however many years since these people became the names to cite, and sort of this repetition of citation that sort of reinforces the repetition to continue. So I wonder if we can talk a little bit about those ethics of citation, and I think we're all sort of on the same page here that people should not be uncritically citing known sexual predators among other people who, maybe are racist or anti-Semitic or misogynist or et cetera. And so can we talk a little bit about those ethics and why it matters?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Who wants to go?
I'll say something if that's all right. So I sit on the editorial board of a prominent journal in Hebrew Bible or Old Testament studies. And I think it was last month or maybe 2 months ago, it was closer to 2 months ago, I was reviewing a submission. And the submission cited Houston repeatedly without any comment, just his work, and as if he was just a regular person who did regular work, and there was nothing extraordinary about him that demanded comment. And among the other critiques that I offered of the submission, I wrote back to the author, whoever it was, and I said, you can't cite somebody like this without also at least noting the problems that this person poses to the field and to society at large. You should try to avoid citing him, but if you cannot, you have to put in some kind of qualifying note to let the reader know that this is a problematic person. So I think that it's possible that this person, I have the feeling that this person was either an early career scholar or a graduate student, just by the nature of the submission itself. And I didn't offer this comment as any kind of personal assault on this person's integrity as a scholar. But I really think that it is important for us when we find submissions like this to let people know there are ways of, if you can't avoid citing somebody, at least letting the reader know that you're aware of their bad actions. And that doesn't detract from your abilities as a scholar or the merits of your own contributions. If anything, I think it reinforces the significance of your work as part of a larger network and a larger society and a larger culture that does have to abide by standards, and it reinforces those ethical standards when you make those choices.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that? Yeah, Stephen.
No, I appreciate those thoughts, and Mark, I hope you don't mind me sharing this. This actually came up very presently again. Was it last week, I guess, where at least in academic social media, it spread around that a book had come out with a fairly major academic press, and it was an edited volume, a collection of essays by a variety of scholars, clustering around a similar topic. And in addition to it being a volume of only men, which is already its own issue, Houston was one of the contributors to it. And the preface to the book, or, the intro, was dated as having been written while he was in jail. And there wasn't a word about, including Houston, even though he had been in prison. The point is, this is one of those things. It's just a continual slight. It's something this is a common phenomenon. This is a norm in our field, if you will. But anyway, Mark, he brought this up very publicly and explained how he sort of gave a concrete example of what he just talked about and said, look, here are some of the steps I'm going to take. And among them, it was, whenever I'm a reviewer or an editor for a series, if someone is citing Houston or someone like this, we're going to bring this up with the author. And if they're not cited critically with where such that you're not just reproducing their reputation, but along the way, you're disrupting it by saying, look, for X, Y, and Z reasons, I'm citing this person, but here's an important history of this man, and we need to keep this in mind. Mark said they'd be rejecting it. And look, there are people who might object to that approach, but the point is, it is an attempt to disrupt this norm in our field where we are reproducing the reputations and power of people like Houston or a Helmut Custer. And again, I've already said this, and I don't want to keep rambling, but I think one takeaway I want to have to add here is that it's very important that we don't approach this issue the way that, for example, public discussion of police brutality in the United States is often framed, where we're just dealing with a couple of bad apples. This isn't a systemic issue. This is a systemic issue in our field, and this isn't the time to get into we need to get to a point where our instinct isn't to immediately start defending all the dudes who are not molesters. That's good. That's a norm. I mean, that should be the norm.
Yeah, but you don't get a cookie for that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You don't get a reward. Yeah, exactly. But what needs to become a norm in our field is that it's not a space where they feel where their reputations are reproduced, where they can even be in positions like what we're talking about. And I guess before I'm going to move on to y'all, I found myself saying to many people over the last week or two when we were having conversations like what Emily and Meredith and Mark have said, is that it should really motivate us as a field, everyone in it, its institutions, the administrators, everything, that Houston could get out of jail. And within a couple of days of getting out of jail for being convicted of 27,000 or 28,000 videos and images of violent child molestation, that his thought could be, I really feel like I'd be at home again back in biblical studies in those institutions. Like that's what feels comfortable to me now. Like, why don't we want to be a place that is aggressively inhospitable to these types of exploitation, such that someone like Houston would get out and feel like, oh, I don't want that world.
I think it's worth noting also that one of the co-editors of the volume that you mentioned has a history of defending Nazi scholarship. Like a lengthy history.
I didn't know this.
Yeah, so I mean, this ties back into what we've already been discussing, that we're talking here about patriarchal structures, white supremacy, sexism, misogyny, anti-Semitism. These are all, awful bedfellows that leave room in the bed for people like Houston and people like Pervo and other people who engage in sexual harassment and sexual violence in the field and beyond.
Can we just note that when Mark was saying that, like the sun or something got brighter behind him and there was a halo, or since we're in, religious studies and biblical studies, maybe we should start pretending that we're reading signs here. Hey, I know
that's on you, man.
I definitely want to hear more from Meredith and Emily, but I did want to flag, just with all three of y'all having brought up the intersectional nature of this trash that we're talking about, like these phenomena. Annette Reed, who I believe was just appointed professor at Harvard, moving into territory that
Congratulations.
by Kester. She had this tweet. I love that we get to talk about social media for actions. Annette Reed had this fantastic Twitter thread where in one of the points she made about all of these issues that we're discussing that sort of ties it together in the way that Mark and Meredith and Emily are bringing up is she says, look, do we want our field most basically to be a space that's focused on great men and reproducing their reputations? These are the ones that have to be cited. Or do we want it to be a space that's oriented around promoting a diversity of incredibly qualified, expert, diverse voices so that we can advance a variety of important conversations in the field? Like, which one of those is academia to us? And again, to even focus on people who would made a point of rejecting Houston's actions, but saying, well, the scholarship is good, we need to defend it. I mean, which vision of academia do you want? The ossified one that reproduces the same voices, or ones that advances multiple critical edges in a conversation? And I thought Annette really nailed it there. Those are competing visions of this field. And as weird as it sounds, we need to force people to defend the great man one if that's the direction they want to go, because there's really no way to defend it.
Emily, do you want to?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in here. So being a scholar in a precarious role, I just sort of want to remind everybody that in the United States, at least, something like 70% of college classes are taught by non-tenure track faculty. And that means that the people who teach 70% of college classes in the United States are in positions where they can't say shit when something happens to them, or when they know about something, they witness something. And that means that, if you work in a department where there's something going on with a colleague, or your department chair or your dean, your choices are basically shut up and keep a job, or speak up. And in many cases, because a lot of non-tenured faculty are in ununionized workplaces, right, risk losing your employment.
And the risk is so great because you don't have usually if you report something, nothing happens anyway. So it's like, what am I risking my neck for?
And to clarify, Meredith, you mean sorry, you're talking, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're pointing out that even if you're a tenured professor or a tenure track professor and you report something, very little happens then too. So how much more for the contingent faculty is this?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And we know that, statistically, there are more non-tenure track faculty who are not white men, and all of the that are not cis het white men that go along with a sort of weakening of any authority and respect and power that we might have in the systems that we work in. And this is something that has come up a number of times and a number of cases at all of the institutions that I went to school at, and at least two of the three that I've taught at. And this is something that really is not just about any of the people that we have just named here, because frankly, my assumption is that any place where more than one man works, you are likely to have some kind of sexual abuse or harassment situation going on. And I don't know if we need to make some kind of value judgment on the difference between sort of mild sexual harassment and 27,000 images of child sexual abuse. Like, yes, there are degrees, but also there's not degrees for the people who are the victims of this kind of criminal behavior. And
And I guess all of that sort of contributes to a culture where the more sort of heinous versions of rape culture are allowed to exist. right? Like it's the small stuff that we allow to continue because it's not that big of a deal. And, you know, he's the old guard, they don't get it. Those kinds of things, or like, you know, he's just one of these, you know, men who just doesn't think that way or whatever. And, you know, if we allow that kind of culture to exist, then it makes people who are predators safe. It's like the conversations around rape jokes, right? Mm-hmm. The only thing that rape jokes do, or one of the things that rape jokes do, right, is make rapists feel comfortable. Right? So even if people who are telling rape jokes or who are listening to rape jokes or find them amusing are not themselves rapists, it creates a culture where the rapist thinks like, oh, well, I guess they're okay with it. Mm-hmm. I wondered if I could kind of highlight a couple of things that I have noticed coming up that we can talk about. And so there's a couple of things. So one is the idea of censorship, and sort of related to that, the sort of soundbite of cancel culture these days. So at the Journal for Interdisciplinary Biblical Studies, we were inspired by Mark's statement about editorial power and how we can sort of wield that for good. And so we instituted a policy, like Mark suggested, of, you know, if you're going to uncritically cite one of these scholars, then, you know, Jibs isn't really for you. And I saw the word censorship around in reaction to that, not by an overwhelming majority or anything, but yeah, just the idea of sort of, well, you're censoring scholarship. And then there's also this idea that comes out, which we haven't talked about yet, which is the idea that you can somehow separate a human from a scholar. Mm-hmm. Like there's a private life and there's a scholar life, and somehow those things are different. And so, you know, we have to keep the scholar even if we don't like the human. For some reason. And I think, I can't remember who brought this up. It might have been Stephen talking about Annette Yoshika Reed's tweet about, you know, how protecting the scholar actually excludes new ideas, excludes people who are trying to come up in the guild and do things a little bit differently. So I'm just kind of throwing those topics out there as things that we may want to address, because I know that does come up a lot.
It just seems to me, just if I can add very, very briefly, following up on your comment with respect to censorship, complaining that a journal is not letting us an article in because of its citation practices, and that calling that censorship, then every journal engages in censorship by the peer review process. I mean, it's not a public forum, right? You don't, by submitting an article manuscript to a journal, you don't get published if it doesn't meet standards of the journal. Yeah. And every journal has its own standards. You know, if you publish something in the Journal of Religion, it's going to require a different kind of article than if you publish something in Vetus Testamentum or the Journal for Semitic Studies. You know, the Journal of Religion is not interested in the kind of, you know, very, very, very specific technical discussion that you might find in Basor. So they're probably going to reject the article, or at least impose some very serious restrictions upon what you need to do to get it into the journal. The whole peer review process is by is really, I think, crossing the line. And it seems to me that what Jibs is doing is just imposing a standard that is specific to itself, its journal. And that's no different than the standards that other journals impose upon authors that offer submissions to them too.
I totally agree. It's not a right to publish in an academic journal.
Exactly. And to follow up on both of your points, with two quick things. One is, I mean, one of the things we like to study in all of us here in religious studies and early Christian ancient Jewish studies, and it's something that causes people's eyes to glaze over when they first hear about it in the abstract. We like to study how things are classified and categorization. And one of the points that's very basic for all of our courses, and we try to teach our students, is that there's a politics or partisanship to classification. There's power in it. Like when you label things one thing, like religion versus cult, you know, is a classic one, or you know, deviancy versus normalcy, or whatever, anything. It's empowering and making some people look normal, and it's discrediting others. But the magic happens because we don't notice that this has happened, right? And why am I talking about this? Because it's the same with accusing a journal of censorship over this. Because as all of you are pointing out, all journals engage in exclusion of various pieces for a variety of criteria. It just so happens that the people complaining about what Gibbs has done with this policy, they want to label exclusion of predatory white men who cause harm to others as censorship, but they don't want to label, the exclusion of the victims of such predation who never get to a point in their career where they can submit an article to Gibbs. That's apparently not censorship, which is an aside, a different thing. Like if we reorient the conversation and cease focusing on the great men, but instead focus on what do we want our field to be? What does it look like to have an ethical, scholarly field that's still producing even more awesome knowledge, by the way? And B, it's not an extension of all the exploitation that happens in society. Then we have a field where the censorship we care more about are all of the people, the massively greater number of people who are excluded from the field and even reaching a point where they can engage in scholarship because of abusers, then the small number of abusers that we catch and say, I'm sorry, I don't think this is a home for you here. But more than that are people who want to promote them and not engage or deal with the fact that they've caused this abuse. So I don't know, I guess in my mind, we need to be reversing the question of censorship. What's censorship? Abusing people out of the field and reproducing rape culture, or causing a group of people who are already in powerful positions who've had a long chance of having their voices heard to have their voice heard a little less and face consequences of causing harm to others. I mean, I think when we frame it that way, this is the thing, is I think when we sort of frame it that way, a lot of the people who might instinctively be like, this is censorship, I think it can actually activate a lot of them into a way of thinking about the situation they hadn't thought of before, because again, patriarchy is a naturalized thing. It's something that our brains identify with without realizing it. And that's part of what makes it so insidious. It's like it's like when we teach our students about racism, for example, pretty much everyone in my classroom agrees that someone wearing a Klan uniform and driving around, setting up burning crosses in the yards of African-American churches, that's racism. But it's harder because of how our public conversation is oriented to get them to see the more pervasive forms of racism that aren't necessarily explicitly consciously chosen by people, but that cause arguably just as much or more harm. And
I'd like to jump in on this idea of censorship and protecting the rights of abusers to publish or teach or whatever it might be. UCSB had a really significant and important situation with Gurinder Singh Mann, who was a professor there teaching in Sikh studies, and he the findings were that he had in fact done various types of sexual harassment, touched some students inappropriately and this sort of thing. And just while I was at UCSB in residence, there were two women that I know who were studying under him who left the program, right? So he stayed there and taught for several years before all of these charges were actually dealt with by UC Santa Barbara. And in the meantime, he was still teaching, was still writing, and two women were essentially, forced to leave because of the position that he had, in the department and within the field. And so, if we want to talk about censorship, like, we have literally driven two brilliant and caring women scholars out of the field by allowing this kind of abuse to continue. And, the idea that we need the brilliant scholarship of these men is bullshit garbage. There are plenty, there are no great men. Like, that's just not how the world works. No offense, gentlemen, but like, greatness is like, that's just not a thing in scholarship. That's not how scholarship works. You know, like, so you know, Pervo came up with a really important thing about dating acts. Well, what about the kids that were abused in these like, what if they had been equally great, right? They had the potential to be equally great at whatever. I mean, what right? What if we have lost the potential scholarship in our own fields of these victims because this kind of abuse can really fuck you up,
We
like, as a human, right?
we really have, and in fact, on Twitter, I posted a thread from a friend of mine, who is brilliant and kind and courageous, and who was abused sexually, at multiple points in her life, and while she was in an academic program, and she received no support from the program. She received no support from colleagues or advisors, and she left the field as a result. And I think about how specifically the field of Jewish studies, which is where she was working, would have really benefited from her like bold intellect and you know, creative, imaginative, critical thinking. And we'll never know now, because she just turned her back on the field, and understandably so, because the monster that underlies the institution is just too great for a single person to take on. They can't. None of us can. We have to form a united front, and that's very, very difficult to do when people are socialized to just accept the inevitable success and triumph of the monster that they might otherwise face.
One thing
I also think it's a problem. I mean, it's a difficulty as well. It's a lot easier with these public cases that we've been talking about with, you know, Houston and Pervo and Kester, where we can point to documents and say, like, this person did this, and here's what the law said. It's a lot more difficult when you've got whisper network people,
Yes.
right? And I have a little list that I keep, and it's private, and I'm not sharing it with anyone, but I have a list. It's definitely not exhaustive. But how do we deal with those ones, right? Which is often a little bit trickier, especially for people who are in precarious employment positions, where, like, and also like journals, like, I can't publish things that could be considered libel.
Meredith, can I ask you a question? Just, would you mind? I'm sorry to do this. I know you're the moderator. I just wanted to bring this up because could you explain to the listeners what whisper network means? Just because I remember the first time I heard it several years ago, it was new to me.
Yeah.
Even though I read, anyway, so.
Well,
yeah,
and
I mean,
it would be new
sorry,
to
Emily.
a man. Yeah,
Yep.
it
No,
would be
that's
new
fair.
to a man, right? That's part of
That's
why you're
Yeah.
asking the question here. Yeah.
No, it's absolutely.
The whisper network is where often women tell each other people to stay away from. We warn each other, like, this guy's a creep. This I got sexually harassed by this one. I know someone who was sexually assaulted by this person. You know, stay away. Warn your students. And it's the whisper network. You don't have proof of anything except for your experience or your friends' experiences or your students' experiences. Yeah. So it's not in the public. It's whispered.
One thing that really frustrates me is that it's not just it's not just men who make these whisper networks necessary. It's also women, often older scholars, who are complicit.
Oh my God, yeah.
Yeah, I very recently, and I can't mention names for legal purposes right now, but I was contacted by a senior scholar who I know for a fact has been trying to rally support to protect a well-known subject of the whisper network. And it's really, you know, it's astounding to me how effective predators are at setting up powerful allies who can later, you know, protect them or insulate them because these allies have power and because these allies have been in the field for a long time. And it's also astounding to me how even when confronted with evidence of bad action, these allies still feel tethered to the bad actor and still want to advocate on their behalf. I'm not sure where this particular case is going to wind up going, But if I'm able to go public, if I'm able to say what I know publicly without imperiling people who are currently vulnerable, I absolutely will. But until then, it's just so demoralizing.
Yeah. So I guess I would like to bring us into sort of some more practicalities. Like, okay, so we all agree we would like to make the world a hostile place for predators. We all agree that we're gonna do what we can to make our scholarship a hostile place for predators. What on earth are we going to do about it? Like, how do we enact this? So, okay, we've got some journals with some policies, and we can do things on a personal basis and, push back with editors or reviewers who say, well, how come you didn't cite so-and-so for this? But I think it would be really helpful if we can come up with some sort of tips, I guess. And I again would like us to think about people who, there's a role for people who have tenure and who feel that they can act with tenure and with sort of more or less impunity. And there's also, we need to give some advice for people who are coming up in academia or who have precarious positions or who are vulnerable for other reasons, because if we're going to make the community a safe place for people to do their scholarship, then we can't just, reinforce those same hierarchies again. So I wonder if I can kind of start maybe by just highlighting the work of the SB Allies. Basically, the SB Allies are lovely, thank you. They're an organization. It's informal, that is working to help people who are experiencing sexual harassment in the SBL and the AAR meetings. I'm a member. We wear giant badges at the meetings. If anyone needs help navigating the policies of SBL harassment policies, things like that, then that's what we're there to do. But I wonder if people have other. Let's make the meetings hostile. I saw Pervo at SBL meetings for years. After we've got meetings, we've got workshops. I run a research seminar at the University of Sheffield, so I'm thinking about how I make that space, hostile to people that would do violence to our community. Like, what are some other tactics for this?
Can I chime in for a second on this?
Please.
Okay. So first of all, I'm also a member of SB Allies. And it's a remarkably effective resource, not only for helping people navigate the superstructure of SBL in a way that can solve problems or at least prohibit some fallout or do some damage control. We also have started opening ourselves up to just being present at sessions where we know bad actors are going to be making an appearance. In fact, at the last in-person SBL meeting, I joined, I think, one other person in being present in the front row. Sorry, two other people were with me in the front row of a session where we knew a well-known harasser was getting up to speak. And one person who was there from SB Allies actually, in his own comment, didn't name the person, but made it known that he was there for the purposes of establishing a safer space. And I think that it's important for people to know that they can call SB Allies members to rally behind them or stand with them or sit next to them and just be present if they're feeling anxiety or if they're feeling threatened at the prospect of being in a session where somebody like that is going to be. The other thing I would like to say is that there was a session where I was speaking a number of years ago. It was a regional SBL, and somebody who I knew to be a bad actor, not just in terms of being a harasser, but also being a bigot, raised their hand to offer more of a comment than a question, of course. And so, but they voiced this comment in upspeak, so it sounded like a question. And my response at the time just sort of intuitively was just to say, I'm not going to be taking that question. I'll take the next question, please. And honestly, nobody gave me shit for that. Nobody said, hey, you can't do that. You can do that. I think even as an early career scholar, you do have the option to just say, I don't think I can answer that question. I'll take the next one. If you're comfortable doing that. And if you're not comfortable doing that, it's totally understandable. But I think that if you have a little bit more security in your job, and you're either tenure track or your tenure, that's an option, and it's a non-confrontational option that you can pursue that just puts the kibosh immediately on giving oxygen to somebody who doesn't deserve it. And lastly, I'd like to note, I do have a piece coming out in the JBL forum issue shortly, I think in the spring, hopefully in the spring, where I walk through some steps of things that we can do. And we've already talked about some of those things, i.e., or one of those things, i.e., keeping journal editors and volume editors accountable and making demands on them as contributors to an edited volume, for example, that you don't want your work to appear alongside somebody who has a reputation for being a bad actor. And if you're in a position where you can do it, even maybe expressing your willingness to pull your piece unless acceptable and responsible measures are taken to keep this bad actor from contributing, or at least tamping down on the rhetoric of their own contribution that might be transgressive.
Mm.
Can I ask a follow-up question for especially Meredith and Mark on that point?
Sure.
And both of y'all are editors of academic venues, so I really appreciate Mark's thoughts there. But in keeping with a theme that especially Emily has reminded us of, how, and Mark and Meredith have been very conscious of how we have different positions in our field, right? And so we have the more vulnerable early career researchers, whether they're grad students or contingent faculty or people who are seeking for jobs. Like, as y'all are aware, it's a very different thing for one of them to try to put that pressure or desire to an editor versus someone who doesn't feel like they just have to have another line on their CV right now. Could y'all give any advice specifically aimed at early career researchers for how they might do this as editors? Like, what your thoughts are on, what you see where I'm going with this. I'd love to hear y'all talk to early career people who feel more vulnerable about how they could participate in this, but without, feeling like they're ruining themselves.
Yeah. So, for me, we said, I said this on Twitter, using the Jibs handle, but like it's not like if I get an article and I notice that someone on my list is cited, it's not an automatic reject where like that person just doesn't, like I don't know all the people in the Whisper list. Like, of course I don't know. So there's going to be people that I miss, and there's going to be people who don't know my list, right? So I want it, as an editor, I want it to be a conversation between the editorial team and an author. Like, here's what I noticed in your paper. Let's have a conversation about how we can deal with this and strategize some ways that we can avoid reinforcing this person's reputation. And I think there's a number of ways to do it. And I think this is why having more editors have these kinds of policies is super duper important. Because if you submit an article to a journal whose editors are not aware of these problems or who don't care about citational ethics, and you've just not cited a specific person, you are going to get pushback from reviewers who are like, why didn't you cite the specific person? And you are protected as an author when you have an editorial policy that says, we don't accept uncritical citations by scholars who are predators. So I think that is one way of kind of protecting more vulnerable scholars in our field, is by having sort of umbrella policies rather than leaving it up to the individual. I don't know, Mark, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, just very briefly, and this is not anything that would be necessarily surprising, but if you're an early career person or a graduate student and you're concerned about these bad actors in the field, find good actors in the field. There are a lot of more well-established or experienced scholars who want to help, who want to be there for you and to help you find opportunities and help you avoid confrontations that can be harmful. And I count myself in that category. We we have the abilities to do that and the willingness to do that and the resources to do that. We want to do that. When I was a graduate student and really just in the first year or two outside of my program, very early in my career, yeah, I was hesitant, to talk to senior scholars because, I was enculturated in a program and in a field which established those sort of hierarchical boundaries. And you're not supposed to transgress and be too familiar with somebody who's a well-known, scholar. You have to be a supplicant. And, that I don't think that holds. And I don't think it ever should have held, but I don't think it holds anymore. And I think a lot of people who are out in the field and have been out in the field for, 10, 15, 20 years, they want to help. Like, they want to be your allies. They want to be supportive. And I can just tell you for myself, and I've said this many times to many friends, I can write another article on the Book of the 12 and not even 12 people will ever wind up reading it, because, and I'll still do it because that's what I do. But what's much more meaningful to me as a scholar is making a better field. And what I find much more gratifying is working with early career people and graduate students, not just in terms of their research and mentoring them in terms of research, but also in terms of navigating the field and being a resource for them. Not just in terms of writing letters, but just sometimes having the ability to listen to them if they need to complain about something, or if they're seeking advice about something, or if they just want like a shoulder to cry on. We're out there and we want to help. And I think that that's a very, very big, if sort of soft part of the field. It's a very important part of the field to know that you do have people that you can trust and people that you can rely on and people who you can talk to for different reasons, for different purposes, who will listen and who do want to be there to help you.
Mm-hmm. I also, oh, sorry, Emily, go ahead. I'll talk.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in as a precarious scholar and teacher. I don't, I started teaching as a TA in 2005 and started teaching my own classes in 2010. So I don't know at which point I stopped being early career. Like I'm in my mid 40s. Like I don't know when that stops. But as a non-tenure track scholar, I work semester to semester contracts. And for me, one of the things that I think for scholars in contingent positions is like, get your paper. And if you have to do some things that you might wish you didn't do, like you need, you feel like you need a citation to put on your CV to try and get a job. If you're, invited to contribute to something that if you were in a tenured position, you might be able to raise a stink about, like, if you are able to get yourself into a position that is stronger where you can begin being mouthy and making a scene, then I think that's like,
Yeah.
it's a little bit shitty to just be all like, do what you need to do. But the way precarity works in the academy, like, I would rather know that, a person that I know has published in a manthology with Houston as a contingent scholar, because that citation is really going to get them a strong line on a CV that is going to help them, or even if they can just start chipping away a little bit, like maybe weasel in a conditional citation, right? All those things I think are really helpful.
And I definitely think you're right that like we can't like recommend a blanket, everyone needs to do this one thing in order for this problem to be solved, because it's just not going to work. It's not possible for some people, and some people doing one small thing puts their careers in a great deal of danger. And for other people, like a big thing doesn't put their careers in any danger at all. And so I think we do have to be really aware of, as you said, that like, if someone needs to get a journal out in that edited volume or in that journal, or to help them get hired. Maybe that like collected volume, the editor is on the hiring committee. You just have to do what you have to do, and when you can make a small change, you make a small change. And absolutely, people who are able to make like larger, or I don't know, noisier sort of push back against this, it's our responsibility to take on the brunt of that.
Absolutely.
So I wonder if we can kind of circle back a little bit to the issue of, so we kind of gave some practical tips for like attending conferences with the SB allies for Citation. What about more generally, like SBL likes to talk about the big tent, right? But like, how do we make that tent a little smaller? What are some things that we can do? Yeah, Emily.
Well, I recently sent an email to the SBL exec committee, and I was like, look, I see that Dan Houston is not currently in the membership directory, but he needs to be banned from future membership. He needs to be banned from attending all SBL cons, and all SBL affiliated publications need to not publish his work. I'm not even taking the step with them of going like, hey, the citations. I'm just like, don't even publish his work. And I reminded them about the Pervo thing. Like, they let him present a bunch of papers. He published reviews. They published a glowing obituary of him, which has since been pulled because of complaints. But like, I just sent an email, and I was like, y'all got a problem. And again, for me, right, like, yes, I'm in a precarious position, but like, the way the job market goes, I am no longer holding out hope for anything significantly better than what I'm at right now. And so, for me, I'm just like, fuck it. What are you going to do? I'm going to lose my shitty job, which I won't, because I'm at a unionized college anyway. But
yeah, join a union, everyone. Join a union.
Join your union. So, and I feel really good because I managed to make this email polite and appropriate, which I have not always done in my emails to SBL exec. But this one, I felt very good about that. Like, you can say this stuff without saying it in a way that is perhaps more risky, right? Like, I just sent a fairly polite message, like, he's a problem. Your responsibility is to do something, and like, remember the Pervo fiasco. So,
and I think it's also like, I just want to touch on, I feel like a lot of people think like, oh, well, you shouldn't punish these people additionally. It's not about punishing. Yeah. It's not about punishing. It's about protecting the rest of us, right? It's about protecting survivors of sexual abuse and sexual assault to be able to attend conferences like SBL without fear that they're going to run into one of these predators, even if it's not their own predator, right? So I think we need to get away from that idea of like, oh, well, he served his time and we just all need to move on.
Right. SBL is not a public group. As exec has told us a number of times, it is a membership group, right? It's not even like a professional group, right? It's a membership group. Yeah. Well, that means we members can decide what qualifies someone to be a member. And we, at least a conviction should be, like, at the very least, a known conviction should be a disqualifying mark on someone's membership and on someone's ability to publish. And we're not censoring Houston by saying you can't publish. We're saying you can't publish here.
I mean, obviously he hasn't been censored because he keeps making statements. So like, he's not censored. He's got academia.edu.
Right. The internet is free. He can publish whatever he wants, and he has no right to publish in peer-reviewed anything. And like, I am a member of SBL, so that's where I am making a stake. Pervo was a member of Westar. Westar hosts an annual meeting in my town, and so I have been to a number of these meetings, and you know, I'm going to say also, like, Westar wasn't particularly great with Pervo's stuff. So yeah, I mean, I think just sort of even these small steps of just letting them know, like, hey, this is a problem, and no one has a right to any of this, and like censorship is only censorship if it's the government telling you you can't publish something.
Yeah.
So
Agreed. I'd like to also follow up on a dimension of what Meredith had just mentioned, and that is recentering the conversation. So instead, you may remember there was a Facebook thread where I had posted, you know, a number of statements, and we were talking about that a little bit earlier in this conversation, and somebody chimed in saying we were acting like an unchristian, vengeful mob against.
Unchristian.
Yeah. And so, and somebody else chimed in after that and saying, you know, what the hell are you talking about? This is a professional society. I'm not a Christian. You know, this is dumb. And their critique was completely right. So one thing I think that we need to be aware of, and we need to call out if we're able to, is the ethos of forgiveness as a Christian virtue. That is weaponized in order to maintain a hostile space. I had a conversation about this with Susanna Heschel, who, as many of you know, has written extensively about scholars who defend German scholars who took up the swastika during the reign of the Third Reich. And they oftentimes argue that we need to forgive people as a matter of, you know, our good Christian faith, and then, you know, value their scholarship out of that spirit of forgiveness. But, you know, that doesn't fly. You don't forgive Nazis, and you don't forgive people who show absolutely no sign of wanting or earning or wanting to earn forgiveness. You know, when Houston got out of prison, if he had uttered a statement, or if he had made a statement saying something like, you know, I will endeavor to right the wrongs that I caused. I will work to help victims. I will, you know, if he had done anything that actually centered the victims, then that might have shown us some actual remorse on his part. But instead, he wanted to rehabilitate himself. The actual victims didn't matter to him. And I think that we don't offer forgiveness. Forgiveness is earned, not like, you know, expected. And when people chime in with the sort of theocentric, we have to forgive because the Lord tells us to forgive, that's not something that has a place in a professional society. If this was a field that related to, you know, French poetry as opposed to the study of the Bible, this would not be part of the conversation. But alas, it is. And I think that we have to call it out when people make these kind of arguments that center forgiveness for abusers as opposed to centering protection for victims.
And I also think it's especially, like, the era of Yom Kippur release of that statement was especially gross in that context.
Yeah.
Yeah, as a Jew, I really loved that. That was just bang on awesome. Thanks for ruining my Yom Kippur, as if fasting all day isn't bad enough.
You know, what Meredith moved us into this part of the discussion asking, you know, how do we make the tent, you know, the big tent of SBL a bit smaller? And it still just comes naturally to so many people in our field. You know, again, even people who have no interest in actively defending an abuser, it still just comes naturally to people to hear something like, oh yeah, you know, so-and-so mentioned forgiveness. Shouldn't we really be about second chances, you know, or something like that? It's just like this logic, just like, it's like in our, whether you want it to be or not, it's just in many people's blood. And it's, you know, it's, I don't have, again, I don't know this is a great practical suggestion. And it's certainly one that is not as available as an option to early career and scholars and more vulnerable people. And I don't even know how to classify myself in relation to that rubric, by the way. But, you know, as Meredith brought up earlier, this is a practical suggestion that comes to mind for me. As Meredith brought up earlier, you know, the issue of rape jokes. What they do is they make an environment comfortable for rapists. You know, one of the issues we have at SBL is this stuff gets normalized and reproduced, this kind of culture where, you know, oh yeah, shouldn't we forgive? Or, oh, you know, the predator is here, but he does good scholarship, so he should be allowed to speak. Part of the reason this gets normalized is because people in secure positions, it still comes naturally to them to feel like, oh, we shouldn't break decorum here. You know, we just need to let this go, as opposed to doing what, I mean, this will seem like an incendiary example, but I mean, if we had someone in one of our rooms who walked in and was a known enslaver, you know, of people, we wouldn't be like, oh well, you know, we probably need to let this go. I mean, I'm pretty certain there would be a round discussed in the room. I would hope there would be, you know, to what's going on, and they wouldn't be welcome. I mean, and one of the ways we practically, again, if we move down from big picture to small picture, that we practically do that, and I don't know how we normalize this, is we get to a place where we expect people in more secure positions not to get out pitchforks and hunt, but to be willing to call this out. You know, if someone talks about forgiveness, for people to be willing to just speak right up and say, you know, that's a way of talking about forgiveness that really just empowers abusive people. Like, why aren't we more concerned with the rights of the abused who are here? You know, I mean, I don't know. I mean, just, it can look like any number of things, but
it's hard though, because I have been trying, and a lot of people as well. This is not about a sexual predator, but about a transphobe and just an overall really hateful person that a lot of people seem to think is just funny and like posts good memes. And you guys probably know who I'm talking about, but maybe not. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But like, this person is still included in a lot of things. Invited to you know, contribute to volumes, and was on an editorial board at some point. People share links to this person's blog a lot, and just engage with this person and normalize him. And I just feel like there's we don't have that reaction to most people who are doing these things. We just don't, as a guild, we just don't have it.
Yeah, and that's that's what I'm saying. I don't even know. Like, I love you bringing that up, because I mean, I feel bad. I don't want our conversation to be something that causes people to throw their hands up in despair, but obviously we don't want this to be a session of false hope either. I mean, a lot of what we're talking about, the changing of it, means we have to dismantle the common sense that makes people, again, not to go big, but that makes people resonate with the, why don't we just forgive them, as opposed to resonate with the disgust that they are there and they're able to keep causing the exclusion of other people. You know,
Emily, I talked over you before. What was it, Emily?
Oh, I was just going to point out that one of the things I have taken to doing when we talk about forgiveness, like someone literally just yesterday asked me, well, served time, shouldn't they be forgiven? And I was like, I can't forgive this person for anything.
Mm-hmm.
I am not a victim of child sexual abuse at the hands of Pervo or Houston. So I can't forgive them for that because they haven't done anything to me, right? And it is not the job of SBL to issue forgiveness or rehabilitation. Like, that is not our job. And you know, so I think, you know, redirecting this talk about forgiveness by bringing it back to, you know, the survivors of this kind of abuse, and framing it right. I mean, these are victims of criminal activities. And I know there's a lot of concern about referring to folks as victims, but they are victims of crime. And, you know, when we start, especially when we have people who have been convicted, right? We can definitely say that those people are criminals. You know, and I think that helps.
Thanks, Emily, for that as well. I just want to invite any sort of final thoughts as we're sort of wrapping up the discussion. If people have any sort of last tips in terms of practicalities, or any comments about sort of the ethics of our discussion, this is sort of the chance to say them.
So, I mean, in terms of practical tips, y'all have shared a lot of them throughout the conversation. One thing, and I'll just share something that I've adopted recently, and this goes back to something Meredith said earlier. Meredith brought up how sometimes there's an objection to the idea of not citing a well-known predator because, oh, this is just the usual person. And Meredith had this really interesting way of putting it, saying that sometimes that can indicate a lack of imagination, on the people working, because it does take more work to dig up other scholars, but that's also what we call scholarship, like doing research and seeing what the broader voices are saying. So anyway, I was inspired to do what I'm about to say with my work actually by Meredith and some other of her colleagues several years ago, and it's this. It's something more like positive, trying to reframe what the field is kind of thing. So one of the areas I work in is Pauline studies, and as people may or may not know, it's a very open secret that it's heavily dominated by white men, and especially some senior white male voices, many of whom have done fantastic stuff for the field, yes, but their stuff just gets recycled as the stuff that has to be talked about. And then a lot of them aren't that interesting, but the recycling of their names means the same questions get recycled over and over again. So the long and the short of this is the policy I adopted for publishing in that field is that I make sure that at least 50% of the scholars that are named in the main body text of my article cannot be white men. And when I first thought of this years ago or started thinking about it, I was like, yeah, it seems so difficult because it's the norm in our field to just have footnotes, mountains of them piled up with references to these guys. And honestly, it's improved my work immeasurably because it's not just a superficial, I'm going to cite some different people to cite them. It's no, I'm going to engage with a broader array of questions that really have made me more interested in writing in that field again, to be honest. And so, and then just, I want to say this without sounding like I'm trying to brag or self-promote, but the concern I've encountered when I share this with people, especially other early career people, is like, well, if I don't cite them, isn't my stuff going to get rejected? No one will accept it. A recent piece I did this to, I submitted it for the Actemeyer Award at SBL and won it. And no one complained about this at all. And then submitted it to a journal, and there wasn't a single peep about this from the editors. And it was a very traditional New Testament studies journal too. So the point is, I think this goes along with what y'all have said, and I'll shut this comment down now, is that you might get pushback from this for some people, but I think a large chunk of the people in our field, sure, we don't want to paint a rosy picture here, but there are a lot of people in the field who want a better, more interesting place. And so that's just my simple strategy, is deciding that at least half the people, it should be more honestly, but at least half the scholars that I'll name in the text will be non-white male scholars. And that's not superficial. It changes your work for the better.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it's really bettering the field in more than one way then, right? Like not only are we then, doing the sort of negative citational ethics where we don't cite people, but we're actually bringing in the people who ought to be cited and not just replicating those hierarchies. Any final thoughts from anyone?
I would just like to add a sort of request from people who are tenured and in secure positions, particularly senior scholars who have established reputations. Like as a contingent faculty person, like I'm asking you to take steps to protect the safety of folks who are contingent, of graduate students and undergraduate students. Like it is a weakness when that stuff is allowed to continue without comment. And if you are tenured and if you are a senior scholar with an established reputation, please put that to use to help protect folks who need protecting.
I mean, if you don't do that, you're actually risking the health and longevity of your department, right? Like people are not going to come to your department if you are protecting abusers, because people just won't come. The whisper network gets around. So I think this is really not just about, wokeness or whatever. This is about protecting the health and stability of the discipline that we all chose to make our careers in and that we really care about. So I think maybe we'll leave it at that. And Mark, do you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I think everybody said what was already on my mind, and I've shared enough already. I'm just very grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation, not only with colleagues who I genuinely like and respect so much, but just for the opportunity for us to all get together and put this out there so that people can use it as a resource. And I hope people, if there is one thing I'd like to add, I would like to encourage anybody who wants to contact me or reach out to me to just do it. Please don't be hesitant. I want to be part of your scholarly world, and not just as somebody who you might cite as a researcher, but also as a resource on a personal level if you need the help. So please reach out to me. I'm Canadian, like I have to be nice. so I promise I'll write back, and I'm happy to talk to anybody who needs to talk to me.
Thanks so much for that offer, Mark, and thanks to Herbs and Paulus as well for hosting this really productive and fruitful conversation. So thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.